Alright, so last week I did a video about the Austrian school, the Rothschilds, etc., right? And now I'm going to do a video more about the Rothschilds. Why? Because a lot of people in this alternative media, they talk about it. So, let's examine, do they have something legitimate to say, or is this all crap? And then if I do a search on YouTube, right, Rothschild Federal Reserve, you see a lot of videos with hundreds of thousands of views about the Rothschilds and etc., right? The Federal Reserve. And let's try to look at some of these conspiracies. Let's try to see whether they have some legitimacy or not. Okay, so I want to look at a few sources where people haven't heard about, that aren't known to be crazies, right? Or that have the reputation of being crazy. So I want an unbiased perspective, right? So I go to the history of the great fortunes, and I talked about it in my last video. And the author is Gustavus Myers. This is at archive.org. And then I could just do a search for Rothschild in here, and I did find it. Okay, so you can see that I just did a Control F feature, and then I'm going to hit Control plus to try to zoom in. Or I'll zoom out right now. Okay. It says, under the surface, the Rothschilds have had or have long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were powers in the old Bank of the United States. And then it seems to be cut off here. I don't know why it got cut off. It must be some of the format in from archive.org. Okay. Some people may say, okay, that's only one sentence. Let's try to look at some other sources talking about who owned the first Bank of the United States. Second source, San Jose State University, Department of Economics. Okay. So it goes to talk about the first Bank of the United States. And then it says, the Bank of the United States solved many of the monetary problems that troubled the country before 1791. But the Bank of the United States was a private institution, and foreign buyers purchased ownership shares of the bank until the 70% of the bank was owned by foreigners, right? Who are the Rothschilds? They were foreign bankers. So if you look at what Gustavus Myers said in this text over here, right? So you have two different sources indicating that, hey, you might have had these foreign bankers, or you did have foreign bankers, and a lot of people speculate that it was the Rothschilds. Gustavus Myers flat out says that these guys were the powers in the old Bank of the United States. So this is not some sort of crackpot conspiracy. They did own the first central bank. Now the question is, who owns the Federal Reserve right now? You could see some charts floating about in different parts of, what is it called? The interwebs, right? But now the question is, are these charts accurate, and do we have the same players owning the Federal Reserve? My gut feeling, as most of you know, they're affluent individuals and they're bankers as well. And it wouldn't be surprising that these rich families of Europe are still in control of the Federal Reserve. Alright, the next conspiracy a lot of people, or what people allege to be conspiracy, is that, hey, the Rothschilds are involved in the wars, they finance both sides, or they're involved in some parts of the war. Okay, let's try to look at historical evidence where they have funded wars, where it's not crazy to say that, hey, they have financed wars. Let's look at one source, Civilization Hijacked, right? You could look at this all over the internet, books, whatever. It's there. For his next campaign, instead of borrowing, Napoleon in 1803 sold the territory west of the Mississippi to Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the U.S., for $3 million in gold. He quickly gathered together an army with $3 million and set about conquering much of Europe. Everywhere he went, Napoleon discovered that his opposition was being financed by the Bank of England. Austria, and finally Russia all went heavily into debt trying to stop him. You can imagine the colossal amount of interest paid to the Bank of England. 4 years later, Nathan Rothschild made the first move in the game that was to make the Rothschild family business the richest that the world had ever seen. He illegally smuggled a shipment of gold through France to the Duke of Wellington to finance an attack from Spain. Napoleon's vicious victories in Europe and his defeat in Russia finally led to the Battle of Waterloo. With the 74,000 of Napoleon's army facing British and Allied forces of 67,000 led by the Duke of Wellington, it was too close to call. Nathan Rothschild thought of a colossal confidence trick he could use to completely take full control of the British bond market, stock market, and Bank of England. He knew that whatever side lost, their currency would be greatly depreciated. He sent an agent to France to be close by the battlefield and quickly return as soon as the result was clear. Nathan received the news of Napoleon's defeat 24 hours before the official courier. With this knowledge, Nathan took up his place at the stock market. According to historical accounts, he looked very dejected as he started to sell English bonds. It was by this deceit and trickery that he misled stockbrokers to believe that Wellington had lost the battle, and everyone started to sell. The value of the English bonds fell until they were virtually given away. Meanwhile, Rothschild began to secretly buy up all the hugely devalued bonds at a very small fraction of what they were worth a few hours ago. In this way, Nathan Rothschild fraudulently accumulated more wealth in one afternoon than both Napoleon and Wellington had done in their entire lifetime. And then, so there you go. So members of this family, you could say, were nefarious to try to accumulate all of this wealth. This is not using free market forces. This is a fraud. And if you want to look at what ended up happening, they financed the wars, or they financed this war for sure. Now, if you want to look at other situations, let's figure out whether there were also nefarious reasons in financing wars in the past. Alright, in this one book by Jerry Robinson, he talks about the Rothschild, and I chronicled it last week. And now we could look at a few sources to see, okay, are they involved in all these wars? It is reported that Rothschild, eager for renewal of the first bank charter, issued a bold threat to U.S. Congress. Either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. But on March 3rd, 1811, after the bank's 20-year charter had expired, the Congress voted against renewing it. In the following year, mountainous conflicts between the British and the United States led to the War of 1812. The British war efforts were funded by none other than the Rothschild family. 4 years later, in the wake of the war, the U.S. was crippled by inflation and rising unemployment. Not surprisingly, the money-hungry Congress moved to charter the second bank of the United States. And if you think about this, right? If you go through war, you go up through high deficits. So the thought process is, okay, how are you going to finance the government? Well, you need a central bank then to keep interest rates low in order to make sure that the country doesn't go broke, right? We would go bankrupt if interest rates were at the market rate. So that's something to think about, okay? Some people might say, okay, there's no way to prove when it's reported that Rothschild were eager to have the renewal of the first bank charter. Okay, now let's look at some of the financials and how they profited off of this war. Alright, so now I'm looking at the Encyclopedia of War of 1812. And long story short, before I get in, they're just talking about the British and Canadian banking system during that time and how everything was funded via the government, via property taxes. Then we go on to this over here, and then it talks about the Rothschild. Meanwhile, the House of Rothschild assisted the British government in fighting the Napoleonic Wars and indirectly the War of 1812. From 1813 to 1815, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, head of N.M. Rothschild and Sons in London, provided large loans to finance the shipment of bullion to the Duke of Wellington's army in Portugal and Spain. Additionally, Rothschild arranged loans to pay British subsidies to continental allies. In 1815 alone, he provided 9.8 million pounds for this purpose. A lot of money back then. By 1817, N.M. Rothschild and Sons had garnered 40% profits from support of the British government's wars against Napoleonic France and the United States. So let's get this straight. They had a 40% profit margin in financing the war. And notice how this says indirectly the War of 1812. So what it's saying is they assisted the government fighting the Napoleonic Wars. So there was some sort of intention there. Some people call it nefarious intention. The author left that out. And over here, they said they indirectly supported. Well, I'm not quite sure about that. If you look at some of the text that I've read, it looks like there was some sort of evil intent. But no, once again, we don't know for sure. So, once again, the purpose of doing this video is to examine, okay, are some of these conspiracy theories true? And yeah, to a certain extent they are. So when people say that you're a nut job saying that, hey, the Rothschilds are involved in finance, war, etc., it's true. Now, the question is, what about last century? Well, I think last century, the 20th century, was a bit more complex, and I could delve more into that. Some people say, hey, the Rothschilds funded both sides of the war. I think that bankers were involved in financing both sides of the war, but it was widespread, and I could look at and examine based on the evidence that I have. So, once again, some of these conspiracy theories are true, and could it be true that they are involved in the warfare state right now? Well, once again, I will show that to you in a different video. Anyways, guys, comment below, tell me whether you agree with what I'm saying, disagree, maybe provide me with some links that refute what I'm saying or add on additional information to what I'm saying, right? Once again, I try to look at information that is unbiased, that doesn't have an agenda whatsoever. So, I looked at boring old books that no one probably reads except historians. Anyways, thanks for listening to me, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.